The sauce was breaking. Cecily Drummond spotted it from across the walk-in. That telltale sheen on the surface of the beurre blanc, fat separating from emulsion, the whole thing threatening to collapse into greasy irrelevance, with 40 minutes left before 200 guests walked through the front door of Aurelius. She dropped her canvas market bag on the prep counter, still wearing jeans and her worn-in boots from the Granville Island market, and moved. Ladle, cold water now. The line cook scrambled. Cecily pulled the pan off the heat, worked the whisk in slow controlled circles, coaxing the sauce back from the edge. Nobody spoke. The kitchen held its breath. It came back together. She exhaled. Lower heat than you think you need. Always. The cook nodded fast, the way people nod when they've just narrowly avoided catastrophe and aren't entirely sure how. Cecily had been halfway through choosing radishes at the market when Lawrence Price had called. The sous vide had failed overnight. The lamb for the tasting menu, her lamb, the recipe she'd spent 11 months developing, adjusting, rebuilding, was gone. 200 portions, gone. He needed her in the kitchen. She hadn't even gone home to change. There was no time to think about that now. She moved from station to station, recalibrating, redirecting, pulling the whole kitchen back into alignment the way you'd pull a dislocated shoulder. Fast, decisive, painful for a moment, then better. The menu she'd designed for this night was built around a single philosophy: Canadian ingredients treated with the patience they deserved. The lamb from a farm outside Kamloops. The mushrooms foraged from the interior. The honey sourced from an apiary in the Fraser Valley. Lawrence had looked at her sketches 14 months ago and told her it was ambitious. Then he'd handed them to his publicist and called the menu his. She hadn't said a word. There had been no point. Lawrence Price had 40 years in the industry and a name that opened doors. She was 28 and her last name didn't open anything. She'd told herself it was a trade-off. She'd get her name on the menu eventually. She was still telling herself that when Lawrence appeared at the kitchen entrance at 7:45, straightening his chef's whites, the ones with his initials embroidered above the breast pocket. He looked at the recovered lamb, at the plated amuse-bouche lined up in perfect rows, at Cecily still at the past directing service, and he smiled. Brilliant work tonight. He clapped her on the shoulder once. You can slip out the service exit before the guests arrive. I'll make sure you're compensated for the call-in. She looked at him. The service exit. You're not exactly dressed for the room, Cecily. She glanced down. Jeans, boots. Her faded canvas tote with the logo of a local berry farm printed across the front. He wasn't wrong about the clothes. He was wrong about everything else. Right, she said quietly. I'll just finish the pass notes for Antoine first. Lawrence was already gone. She finished the notes. She briefed Antoine on every potential fragility in the menu, every timing issue, everything that could go sideways if someone panicked. Then she washed her hands, picked up her tote bag, and instead of turning left toward the service exit, she turned right, toward the front of the house. Pippa was standing near the host stand in a burgundy blazer, tablet in hand, watching the first guests filter through the glass doors. She saw Cecily and her expression shifted, relief and alarm at the same time. You saved it, didn't you? The lamb's fine, everything's fine. You're not exactly, Pippa started. I know. Cecily looked around at the room she'd spent 14 months invisibly building. Exposed cedar beams, warm pendant lighting, linen that had taken her 3 weekends to source. The floral arrangement she'd described to the event planner in precise detail. I just wanted to see it once. She stood near the bar, one hand resting on her tote strap, and looked. The room was filling fast. Women in silk and structured blazers. Men in suits that fit the way suits only fit when they cost what most people's rent cost. The kind of room where the glassware mattered, and the lighting was calibrated, and every detail had been decided by someone who cared enormously about being seen caring. She had built this room and she was invisible in it. Excuse me. A woman with a stiff blonde updo and a champagne flute turned toward her, looking her up and down with the slow appraisal of someone evaluating furniture. Are you with the catering? We need more of the mushroom things at table 6. Cecily blinked. I'm the little toast things, with the mushrooms. Can you make sure table 6 gets more? The woman had already turned away, dismissing her before the sentence was finished. Two more people nearby caught the exchange. Someone laughed, not loud but not quiet either, the kind of laugh that expected to be heard. "Did she wander in from the loading dock?" a man in a gray suit said to the woman beside him. "I think she's delivering something." The woman smirked over the rim of her glass. "Bless." Cecily felt the heat rise in her face. She didn't move. She didn't know what she was waiting for. "She's not delivering anything." The voice was low and settled, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to carry. Roman Daly moved through the cluster of guests near the bar with the ease of someone who'd never once considered that a room might not make space for him. Not arrogance, Cecily would think later, but a particular kind of certainty she'd never been allowed to have herself. She'd seen him earlier, briefly, through the kitchen's pass-through window. He'd been standing with Lawrence and two people from the restaurant group's board, and she'd registered him the way you register weather. Present, relevant, not something she had any control over. He stopped beside her, not between her and the people who'd laughed, beside her. It was a small distinction and a significant one. "This is Cecily Drummond," he said, addressing the room around them with a calm that bordered on boredom. "She designed everything you're about to eat tonight. The menu, the sourcing, the technique, all of it. You might want to remember her name." He glanced at the woman with the blonde updo. "Table 6 won't need more of anything. The pacing's intentional." A silence moved through the nearest group. The man in the gray suit looked at his shoes. The smirking woman stopped smirking. "I don't need you to do that," Cecily said under her breath. "I know," Roman said. "I did it because it's accurate." She looked at him properly for the first time. Brown eyes, slightly tired at the edges. The kind of face that had learned to hold things back so thoroughly it had started to look like there was nothing there, until you looked long enough to catch the current running underneath. "How do you know what I designed?" she asked. "I invest in this restaurant group. I read every development file." He paused. "Your name isn't on any of them. Lawrence Price's name is on all of them. I assumed he wrote them." A beat. "Then I watched you run that kitchen for 4 hours through the pass window, and I stopped assuming." She didn't answer. She didn't have an answer that didn't involve 14 months of swallowed pride. Pippa appeared at Cecily's elbow and steered her gently toward the back of the room. She should have left. She nearly did. Then Lawrence stepped onto the small raised platform near the bar and tapped his glass. "Tonight," he said, "represents the culmination of years of vision. This menu, this philosophy, is something I've been developing for a very long time." He smiled warmly at the room. "Canadian terroir, treated with intention. I hope you'll taste what I've poured into this." Cecily felt something tighten in her chest that had no polite name. Roman, standing near the back wall with his arms crossed, watched Lawrence with an expression that gave nothing away and seemed to miss nothing. She left through the service exit, after all. Lawrence called the next morning with praise in his voice and the offer of a senior title. Still no authorship, still no public credit, but a raise that was meant to feel like both. Cecily listened to the whole thing and then said, without planning to, "No." Silence on the line. "No?" "I quit." The word came out steadier than she felt, effective immediately. She spent the rest of the morning sitting at her kitchen table in her apartment in East Vancouver, her notebook open to a page of recipe sketches she'd never shown anyone, and feeling something she was too afraid to call freedom in case it turned out to be just a different kind of fear. Roman called that afternoon. She didn't ask how he'd gotten her number. "I'd like to talk," he said, "not about the restaurant group." "Then about what?" "A beat. What you should have been doing this whole time." She met him at a Portuguese cafe on Commercial Drive. She chose the location, and she wasn't going to let this be a power lunch in a boardroom. He ordered coffee and didn't look at his phone once. She'd half expected the polished version of him from the Gala. What she found instead was someone who listened the way people listen when they're actually trying to understand something, not waiting for their turn to speak. "You have a direction?" he asked. She turned her notebook around and pushed it across the table. He looked at it for a long time, long enough that she started to feel exposed. "This is its own thing," he said finally. "Not Aurelius, not Lawrence Price's aesthetic. This is yours." "It's just sketches." "It's a philosophy." He looked up. "I'd invest in it." She pulled the notebook back. I've heard that before. I know. He didn't try to argue her out of it. What would it take for you to believe someone meant it? Right now? Nothing. I don't trust the question. She said it plainly, not cruelly. I spent 14 months building someone else's name. I'm not doing that again. He nodded slowly. Then don't. Build your own name. I'll back you without being on the label. That's not how investment works. It is when the investor would rather the chef succeed than take credit for discovering her. He wrapped both hands around his mug. I have enough things with my name on them. I don't need yours. She studied him, the particular quietness of someone who wasn't performing sincerity, but also wasn't asking to be trusted on faith. He knew she'd need to see it, not hear it. I'll think about it, she said. She thought about it for 6 days, then she called him back. The terms were hers, the name was hers. Every contract went through a lawyer she chose independently. Roman showed up when she asked him to and stayed away when she didn't. 4 months later, Drummond opened in a heritage building in Strathcona. Exposed brick, communal tables, a kitchen that was visible from every seat in the room. The menu changed weekly based on what was arriving from farms she'd spent years building relationships with. Nothing performative, just Canadian land taken seriously. The first night sold out in 11 hours. What Cecily didn't know then, what Roman had only recently pieced together, was that Coral Whitman, who had been at the Aurelius launch, had made a quiet phone call to Lawrence the morning after the gala. She'd mentioned that Roman seemed taken with the sous chef. Lawrence had moved fast after that. He'd leaked a story to a food industry contact, anonymous, framed as concern, suggesting that Cecily had left Aurelius under disciplinary circumstances, vague enough to be unprovable, specific enough to plant doubt. The story ran. 2 potential suppliers pulled their interest from Drummond before the opening. One investor Roman had been bringing in cited due diligence concerns and withdrew. Cecily found out from Pippa, who had spent 3 sleepless nights running the source back to its origin. Cecily sat on her prep counter in the empty restaurant and read the message twice. Roman arrived 20 minutes later with 2 cups of coffee from the place on the corner, and no pretense of having been in the neighborhood. It was Lawrence, she said. I know. He set a coffee in front of her. I've been looking into it since the week after the gala. You're not the first person he's done this to. She looked up. A chef named Marco Reyes, 4 years ago. Lawrence took full credit for a tasting menu Marco spent 8 months developing. Marco tried to speak up. No one listened. He left the industry for 2 years. Roman paused. He reached out to me last week when the story about you ran. He kept everything. Emails, time-stamped drafts, a recording of a conversation where Lawrence explicitly discusses putting his name on Marco's work. Cecily was quiet for a moment. 4 years he held on to that. He waited because he had no leverage. Now he does, if you'll let him stand with you. She thought about 14 months. About swallowed pride and service exits, and a room she'd built that she'd stood at the edge of like a guest in her own work. Tell him yes, she said. Marco Reyes drove up from Portland with a hard drive and a quietness that came from having held something heavy for a long time. He and Cecily sat at the communal table in Drummond for 3 hours, comparing documents, filling in gaps. The pattern was meticulous and damning. Lawrence had done this at least twice, possibly 3 times, across 15 years in the industry. Roman's lawyer filed a formal complaint with the BC Restaurant and Food Services Association and initiated civil proceedings. The recordings were authenticated. The timestamps on Marco's original files predated Lawrence's earliest public claims by 7 months. Lawrence's publicist released a statement calling it a misunderstanding. The misunderstanding became harder to characterize that way when the documents were published. By the time the association's review committee met, 4 other former colleagues had come forward independently. Lawrence's flagship project, the one that had been using Cecily's methodology as its entire selling point, lost its primary backer within a week. The Aurelius Restaurant Group quietly settled before anything reached a courtroom. Lawrence resigned from every board he sat on within 10 days. The speed of it said everything about what they'd known and chosen to overlook. Coral issued no statement. She simply became, over the course of several weeks, absent from every room she'd previously made a point of being in. Drummond, meanwhile, did not stop running. The week the story about Lawrence broke publicly, Cecily stood at the pass during dinner service and did not look up from her plates. The dining room was full. The reservations list stretched 6 weeks out. Marco joined the team as a consultant. He had a precision with pastry that complemented Cecily's instincts for savory, and he moved through the kitchen with the particular joy of someone who had been away from something they loved and was still surprised, each day, to be back. "When I called you," he said to Cecily one afternoon, trimming the edges of a tart case with an exactness that suggested he'd been doing it since before he could properly remember, "I just wanted to see justice. I didn't expect you to give me a place in here. You should have had a place like this 4 years ago." Cecily didn't look up from her knife work. "I'm just correcting a mistake I wasn't the one to make." Marco nodded and said nothing. Some things didn't need adding to. Roman came in most Tuesday evenings, not to check the books, which he hadn't asked to see in months, but because Tuesday was when Cecily tested new dishes, and he had arrived, without fully deciding to, at the conclusion that being in the building when she was figuring something out was simply the best place he could be. She'd looked at him one evening when he said as much. He hadn't looked away. On a Tuesday in February, 3 months after Drummond had been named one of Canada's top new restaurants by a national publication she'd read as a line cook, Cecily was plating a trial dish, a venison preparation she'd been working on for weeks, built around a birch syrup reduction from a producer in the Yukon. When Roman came through the kitchen door, coat still on, carrying something he'd folded into his jacket pocket. "I'm in the middle of something," she said, without looking up. "I know. I'll wait." She finished the plate. She tasted. She adjusted. She tasted again. Then she looked at him. He was holding a folded piece of paper, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she'd ever seen it. "This is embarrassing," he said, "which I'm mentioning in advance." "Then don't show me." "I'm showing you anyway." He handed her the paper. She unfolded it. It was a drawing, not the work of someone with any particular skill, all rough lines and lopsided proportions, of 2 figures standing in what appeared to be a kitchen, identified by a scrawled label that read "knives" on the wall. One figure held a pan, the other held what was presumably a folder of contracts. Below them, in handwriting that suggested he had pressed too hard with the pen and then tried to compensate, were 4 words. "Will you stay with me?" Not a question about next steps, not a negotiation, just that. Cecily looked at it for a long moment. She thought about everything the question was really asking, about the difference between someone who wanted to be near her talent and someone who wanted to be near her, and whether she'd learned enough by now to tell the one from the other. She thought she had. She folded the paper carefully along its original crease and tucked it into the front pocket of her apron, next to the instant red thermometer and the small notebook where she still sketched recipes she hadn't shown anyone yet. "Yes," she said. Roman smiled, the kind that arrived slowly and then didn't leave. Outside, Vancouver was doing what Vancouver does in February: gray sky, persistent rain, the mountains invisible behind cloud. Inside Drummond, the venison was nearly ready. The kitchen smelled like birch and thyme, and something close to everything she'd worked toward. And Cecily turned back to her pass, with the particular lightness of someone who had finally, after a very long time, arrived precisely where her own name was written above the door.